All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you and welcome again to our Cobol Friday. Last week, we had Jeff Beastie talk about writing his very first COBOL program and what it took, which was preceded by a series of, basic syntax type sessions that I think a lot of you really enjoyed. Our speakers have been spectacular. And today we have one other such spectacular speaker, Scott Cosel. He's been a huge contributor to this COBOL course, both on the GitHub repo, a huge support to the community on our Slack channel, and comes with a wealth of experience. He works at UC Irvine, has been working at UC Irvine for a while. I'm gonna let Scott do a brief introduction of himself and solve this COBOL puzzle for us. What is that all about, Scott? Look forward to it.
Thank you, Siddharshna. Thank you for that introduction. And I've enjoyed the course and being a participant. And now I get to share with you some experience I've had. I've worked as a IBM mainframe customer, I guess, for the last, starting in 1982 at the city of Los Angeles as an intern. Um, And believe it or not, I never took a COBOL coding class, or I did take some programming courses, but as far as COBOL, it was all self-taught on the job. 1982, I was mentored by just a coworker, and in those days we didn't have PCs. We had a terminal that you couldn't even download anything to it. It just was a connection to the mainframe host. That was it. So hopefully we'll have time. I'll show you some pictures of what that looked like. But in any event, I just wanted to share with you some things I've come across in the last, 38 years of COBOL and IBM mainframe. So without further ado, maybe we should get started. So here's what we want to talk about today. Um, I've got some COBOL coding best practices for you. Admittedly, some of these are nice to haves, or just style preference, but they really will help you and anyone that comes along to maintain your code. Do them a favor and use these techniques. Hopefully, they'll serve you during your career if that's what you choose to do. We'll test some unfamiliar COBOL concepts, meaning everyone should have a test program that they can just throw things in that somebody told you about, you heard about, don't quite know how they work. We'll test them out real time, let the computer decide, or show you what's wrong. We'll look at a working program that I wrote back in probably around, I think, 1986. It's still relevant, still runs today. We'll see that. And in that program, it uses table searching, which is another good concept that COBOL handles really well. 3 different methods. We'll review program output, and then we'll make sure we have some time for Q&A. So what are some COBOL coding best practices? Well, these are some best practices. There's plenty. We'll go through these hopefully pretty fast. We won't get bogged down. But the number one that was ingrained to me from my mentor was don't use not in your program. And I like to think that if you have knots, your program is tied up in knots, and it's very difficult to understand, maintain, make changes to. So please use, my mentor said never use not, but I'll make an exception. If it's very straightforward and it's easily understandable, okay. But other than that, just avoid it. Just avoid the word not. It just makes everything a lot simpler. There's plenty of ways to avoid using it. Continue. We'll see some examples of that later. Number 2 is something I picked up along the way somewhere. Someone showed me you can use only one period in a paragraph as the last statement in the paragraph. So we'll see why that's a good practice. A lot of people want to use go to maybe as a beginner, or somebody showed them, oh, you can use go to go to the end of the paragraph. You don't need that. You can, if you have only one period and you have continue, that's where it will end up. It will go to the end of the paragraph all by itself. If you only use one period, and periods can be lost, and you may or may not see them. So if you know there's only one, and the person coming behind you to maintain your program knows that's your style, then they will only they won't have that issue. You'll just have one period per paragraph. Don't use commas, they're not needed. Spaces work fine. They may have been required in the past, they're not anymore. Number 4, please use variable names that are at least 3 characters. If you have a loop variable, such as, like if you're doing a subscript and you're only using the letter I for a loop, it's very hard to find if you try to find a single letter, because it's going to show up everywhere and it's not even going to be a variable. So please use at least 3 characters for a variable name. That will help tremendously. Also, number 5, when you use a perform, you don't need to use perform through. Just use a paragraph name. You don't need to use exit. You may see that in some code you run across. Number 6 was go to. We talked about that. No need to use go to anywhere. I try to use evaluate as an alternative. Hopefully we'll see some of that later. And just as a side note, use when other as the last condition of an evaluate statement. That's like a case statement in other languages. When other handles a final condition where nothing matches your criteria. If you don't have that, I don't know how the current compiler works, but in the past, if you ran across a condition you didn't prepare for and you don't have when other, your program abends and fails, and you don't want that. So also stacked whens are treated as or conditions. So if you have a when and then another when right after it, that means or. That's a little kind of subtle thing that you just learn these things as you go along. Let's go on. And number 7, please never use alter go to, even though it's in the language. And pray you don't run into any code that uses it. And if you do, don't touch it, at least initially. You can go back and try to remediate that if you run across it. Number 8, for debugging in the environment division, use source computer with debugging mode. And what that does is you can turn comments in your program on and off very easily with, instead of using a asterisk in column 7, you can use a D. And when you use source computer with debugging mode, it changes all the D's. I'm sorry, those D's on those lines are not treated as comments. When you just have source computer and something, the D's are changed to asterisks, and they will all be comments. So that's an easy way to turn on and off multiple lines in your program to be on or off just by changing one statement. So we'll see that a little later too. Number 9, please don't write clever code. I'm sorry, it's okay to write clever code, but avoid tricky code and use comments. If you're doing something that isn't quite obvious, and it's not, I mean, it's for the next person. In commercial environments, there's always somebody later that's going to come and try to debug your code, try to add something. If you've done something tricky and it's not commented, um, it's just it's just not nice. I'll say that. Number 10, um, there's a verb called go back, and I think one of the prior sessions, we weren't sure if go back works under CICS. Use that instead of stop run. If you put stop run in your program, when it hits that, your program shuts down, even if it was called by something else. That's usually not what you want to do. You can use go back, and I've been told that exclusively. I've never had a use of stop run. And yes, it works under CICS. We weren't sure about that in a prior session, Cobol Friday session. Number 11, this is this is one of my pet peeves. You should always use end if. It's really difficult if you don't, because if you look at a program and it just has the period ending a paragraph, that's the other thing. If you're only using one period per paragraph, you've got to have end if in your program to make it close off an if statement. This was added to the language in around, Cobol 85. That was a major change to the Cobol language. Before that, you didn't have any of these end if, end read. So that was a major change to the Cobol language. It got immensely better between Cobol 74 standard, Cobol 85 standard, and that was the difference between Cobol 1 and Cobol 2. You might hear that. Cobol 2 introduced all of these items. I don't know what version of Cobol we're on now, what it's called, the nickname, but Cobol 2 includes all of these, and they're very useful and helpful when you're looking at code. Let's move on. Should I ask if there's any questions up to this point? Too fast, too slow? We want to get through all these so we can look at actual code. Siddharshna?
We're good for now, Scott. I think we can keep going here. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Don't have too many more of these. So we talked about continue a little bit. Understand the difference between continue and next sentence. Next sentence jumps to the next period. So if you only have one, continue and next sentence work the same, but there are subtle differences. So anyway, we'll hopefully I can demonstrate that. Continue is basically like no-op in other languages. Next sentence used to be what you had to use as a no-op, but it's now that there's continue, and again, that I believe was introduced in Cobol 85, like around 1985. You really don't really need next sentence anymore, but there is a use for it, and we can look at that. Searching, which we'll talk about later, there's a search and a search all. A search all is a binary search, so that means that whatever you're searching through, the data needs to be sorted, and just know that sorting is based on EBCDIC values, which are different than ASCII values. So I gave an example of the letter A is a hex C1, which sorts higher than a number, and I believe in ASCII it's the opposite. A 1 is a hex F1, and FF is the highest value you can have. So a 1 and all the numbers, and of course a 2 is an F2, etc. That just illustrates how the sorting process works, and the numbers are going to be lower in the sort order than a capital A or letters. Number 14, we heard from Jeff last week. Actually, in commercial practice, they really, every shop I've been in, they've told us to avoid using Cobol sort, unfortunately or fortunately. But typically what you do is in your JCL, you have, and that sets up basically a script of what you want, what programs you want to run. So first step in your JCL, I mean, this isn't generic, but you extract your data from somewhere like a database. The second step is you you sort that data. And the third step is you have a Cobol program or something to create the output file report or a hybrid report. And that's an interesting concept that I ran across, worked with or worked for some very interesting clients, knowledgeable clients, sophisticated clients. They came up with the idea of a report that uses commas in between the values so that they could download that report and throw it in Excel and do whatever they want with it. So it visually looked like a report, and it could also be used as a download file. Very interesting. That came from a client of mine that wanted the best of both worlds, and very interesting. If we have time, we can see that, but may not have time for that. Number 15 is something for debugging when you're running a process through JCL. There is the ability to use temporary data sets that disappear, like interim results when you do something and then you pass that data onto another process, kind of like pipes in Unix. In a commercial environment, you typically keep those data sets because storage is cheap now. It didn't used to be years ago, but it really helps in debugging. When you see what happened, if you can always go to the interim results, see what they look like, and see where your process went south. Oh, you know, that's slang, sorry. Where your process went wrong, and you can, it's just much easier to debug if problems arise. Finally, a lot of examples that we've seen from speakers and in the course that you're working on, hopefully, that the Cobol program, the JCL that was provided appears to do compile, link, and go every time. In a commercial environment, Cobol programs are typically compiled, and the load module or executable is stored somewhere, and then you just execute it and continue to execute that. You don't compile, link, and go every time you want to run a program. It's Cobol is a compiled language, typically not an interpreted language like Rex, although Rex can be compiled. But anyway, I think you guys probably know the difference of interpreted versus compiled. And Cobol is a compiled language, so you compile it and then you just execute it when you need it in a production environment. Number 17, please always have a backup of your source code before you start changing it, even interim changes, because a number of times you get caught and you screw up your program and now it doesn't work anymore. You should always be able to go back to a prior version, especially a production version, but even an interim version, it's very helpful. If you've screwed up your program, you can always go back to the last working version. That'll serve you well. And finally, when you update a program, please make sure you're updating the most recent version of a program, the program that's running in production mode in a commercial environment, you never want to be updating the wrong version, a test version. If you're not sure, ask your boss or coworkers. Make sure you're updating the version that's working, that's in production running. So important. And if you don't do that, it's considered a very junior mistake. So please be aware of that. So those are some best practices.
Quick
I'm sure
question
there's
here, Scott.
plenty more. Go ahead.
Yep. Okay. So one of our audience members, Noam, is asking, do you use any version control, like Git or Subversion? I guess that would be a best practice. Is this?
In a commercial environment, there's a couple of products that I've used over the years. I haven't used them lately. My last position I started in 2012, and we didn't have Panvalet is a very big version control or kind of industry-wide standard. It used to be as of 2012. It is a third-party product from, I think, Computer Associates. There is a charge for it, so my current employer chose not to use that. Did their own version control. Just with internally, we weren't a big shops or compared to what I came from. But Panvalet is a big name in version control. Also, Librarian, I think they're both owned now by Computer Associates. I don't know if Librarian still exists or is marketed. It was what City of Los Angeles used back in the day. This is 1982. But as far as GitHub, I haven't, in my career, that's so new that I don't know if any mainframe shops use that as a version control method. I know I've seen CVS, which is, an old standard, as the version control, but not in a commercial environment. Does that answer the question?
Sounds good. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Any other questions? Whoops, not ready for that.
Not right now.
Okay,
Paul, anything
good.
in our YouTube live stream that you want to bring up? Well, Scott is switching windows. Okay.
Switching gears.
Yeah, no, there's nothing in the YouTube right now. There was a comment about alter, but then Scott addressed it on the next slide.
Okay. Alter goto, don't use that. And goto, depending on, I would discourage that use as well. Again, these things are in the language and were never taken out, but I don't think I've ever seen that used commercially, and I've been in about four shops, I'd have to count, but 4 or 5 different environments where they have their own standards and own code base. Don't think I've ever saw goto depending on, or I do see an alter in my current job, and I don't touch it because I don't even want to figure out what it's doing. I can make my changes around it. Until I'm forced to deal with it, I just leave it alone because it works. Not worth it.
Another comment in the YouTube was that someone mentioned using go back from a subroutine might be acceptable.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Never use stop run. Yes, you have to use go back because otherwise your stop run shuts down everything. You're in a subroutine and you use stop run, you don't return back to the main program. Everything shuts down. So don't use stop run. It's not needed. I'm brought up, can we go on? Okay. I brought up the Visual Studio Code that is part of the course. I just wanted to illustrate something that a lot of people have run into. I brought it up already because mine takes a long time to load, but I know that people, they'll click on, or they'll get to this point, try to click on this, nothing happens. Nothing happens for me. If I click down here, I get the message to check credentials. I mean, this isn't a healthy message or looking healthy, but if you click on this, then it will prompt you for your ID. You can press enter. And then you should be able to pick a filter or click over here, and then we picked a filter, and then it will bring up your data set. So I just wanted to illustrate that's some strange behavior that's happening for me, probably others, I would assume. And that's how I have gotten around it. But for today, for the time we have left, I'm inclined to use the environment that I'm familiar with for the last 38 years, and that's over here. And this is a 3270 emulator. This is the Tom Brennan Vista product emulator. Excellent. I believe there's a free trial for 30 days and longer if as part of the Master the Mainframe course or challenge. And I think that's like 6 months or more. It's only $30 to actually purchase it, so it may be something to think about. Um,
And
so,
Scott, one quick update on that. Tom has graciously, for Master the Mainframe and for learning only because it's not commercial, we do have a license for people to continue to use it in their Master the Mainframe per Tom. So thank you, Tom Brennan.
absolutely, it's excellent. Okay, let's look at some JCL. I'm sorry, some Cobol. Wrong library. So this is a program that I wrote, and look at that date, 1986. It still runs, it still works. Basically, I was given an assignment to capture the size of data sets to keep track, make sure we're not using too much space or the allocations are correct for data sets that are on the system. So this is good practice. A change log of over the years, as you can see, it was put in. I was inexperienced, I guess. I guess nowadays it's kind of flipped. So you put in the log from um, top down, and this person came along and did the Cobol 2 conversion in 2002, put their comment at the bottom, which is kind of the standard. These comments are the reverse order. So I made changes to these behind the scenes, as we'll try to get through some of them, but I flipped these to bring this program up to date. Here's what we're talking about with the source computer with debugging mode. This is turned off because there's an asterisk. So if we see D's down in the code, those are treated as comments. If you have the asterisk on this line, if you change it to look like this, then if there are any D's in your in column 7 in the code, then those will be treated. I don't know if I have them. Yes, I do. Down here, so these are treated as comments. Exhibit doesn't exist in the language anymore, but you can do the same thing with a display and the variable name, and then, or sorry, a literal, and then the variable name. So that can be accomplished. You don't need this verb anymore. Microfocus Cobol does still allow that, and maybe other versions of Cobol, but it's not part of the IBM Cobol anymore exhibit name, because I don't think it's part of the standard. We'll highlight this program. This is the program that takes output from the system, and we want to, what this program is doing basically is it's looking through this table, searching through this table for some codes that it sees in the output from the system and translates that code to a device type. So these are the device types here that I've either saw in a manual or actually ran across. I ran it on this system. This system, the educational system that we're all using, is a little bit boring because just about everything is on a 3390 device, which everything is some variation of that these days. But anyway, let's run this program as it was written. Oh, actually, one more thing to point out. This has the logic in this program. Again, it was written pre Cobol 85, so that doesn't have any end ifs because they didn't exist in the language, and I had to use next sentence. But what's happening here is and we'll look at the final version of this program since we're running a little longer than I expected, but basically next sentence will always jump to the next period, and I've since modified my style to put the period down here, but as you see, there's only one period in this paragraph. But let's actually run this, or we can compile it and run it. Well, actually, I have something non-standard that I've set up for myself to compile a program just like from the command line. So oh, it failed. Well, that's not good. That wasn't supposed to happen, but look at the output here. And because I turned on the with debugging mode, it made these actual executable statements. And again, as we saw, that's not acceptable. So we have to go back and we have to change that. So now with that commented out, we save it. See if I can retrieve the last command that I used. There we go. That's the way I'm compiling this. Now we have a 0 condition. If we look at our output over here, I don't want to do that, but that's another way to look at the output. And the letter N will skip to the next output section. That's the Cobol program. As you see, it got a 0 condition. Also, what I want to show you guys, so let's run it just so we see what it does. So just real quickly, this JCL, we set up a variable here. This is kind of a new feature of the language that sets your user ID to that variable LEV. Then we can use it down below. This first step deletes this data set that I'm going to be using later to make sure that, and this works no matter if it existed before or not. So at the end of this step, it will be deleted no matter if it existed before or not. The next step executes the command like retrieve the data that we want to process. This command, we don't have time to go into what that's actually doing, but just know that that's retrieving the data that I want to process. Oops. We do. That's the wrong key. Okay, we're back. So that was the second step, and the third step, we can put comments in here. Here's the program I just compiled. I'm going to be running it, and it's going to anything with an asterisk here in the column 3 is ignored. There, it's like it's not even there. This is a good standard where you have an I at the end of your DD name that we've seen in prior sessions that controls or connects your Cobol program with the JCL. The I is a standard or kind of a convention that this is going to be used for input. And another standard that I ran across is for output, an R as the 7th character, or the seventh character means report, and the first report. So this is where the output is going to go to my ID test GDG. A GDG is an interesting concept on the mainframe. It's like a, I don't even know what the equivalent would be on in different environment, but basically that creates a new output file, and I've set it up in this example to be 3 unique files. When you create the 4th file, the first one falls off. It's like a backup rolling generation data group. That's how it's just a concept in the IBM mainframe environment. So let's submit this. And it ran. So we'll go to the output, and we can go in with an S and look at everything, or since it ran, we can use a question mark. I'm sorry. In this case, it went to a data set, so that we describe the generation data group. So here are the 3. I've set up 3 generations. So when this one was created, and it keeps track of the numbers. So generation 2055 existed before, it fell off, disappeared, it's gone forever. Here's the newest version, 2058. And this is what the output looks like. It's basically, I just had it list all my data sets and where they're located and when they were created. And here's this is the reason the program was written in the first place, was to interpret some very strange output from the system to try to make sense out of that and put it in more understandable terms. But basically this VSAM file had this much space allocated, used in what, either using tracks, cylinders, how many primary of this it's using, secondary, and how many extensions it's using. You don't want to see this number very high. If you get past 16, that's bad, because 16 was the artificial limit for straight data sets. For VSAM, you can go higher, but that just means your data is all, it's not contiguous. It's basically all fragmented. So 1 is best. When you're below 5, it's probably acceptable. There's ways to remediate that, but that's a different session. So what can we do with that program? The program, as you see, I have different here. I have different iterations of that program. So this was the first one we looked at, the original. We're gonna, for lack of time, we're gonna jump to kind of the end result that I did. Basically, the table, as you saw, that we searched through was coded in the program. That can be removed. And basically what we did was, let's find where that was. I believe at this stage I moved it to a subprogram. Let's go back a version. Again, that's why we have different versions. I can go back on previous versions. Let's see. Not seeing it. I thought I would have more time, but time goes faster than you think. Let's see. Man, I took it out early on, huh? Okay. I'm not seeing it. Okay. So in the first program, the original, we saw where the devices were hard-coded in the program. In this example, we've moved them to a copy library. And that way, when you compile this code, it copies that data in from somewhere else. And if we look in the copy lib, it's called DASD type, and here it is over here. So you can maintain it separately out of the program. So as I described, there's 3 different ways that we can use this data. The first way was hard-coded in a program. The second way is externally as a copybook, which is what this is. That's a little better. The third way, and now I'm not remembering which program had that, but I believe the final program had that method where we are using a call and we can load in that data from a file. Actually, the clue will be in the JCL to run version 5 or 6. Okay, so in this version, version 5, we have a table. This was introduced, and we can pull the data from here. I'm going to put a comment in here, show you a little trick. It has to look like this. This is a comment, but I can use a non-standard macro to come down here and put my cursor there, and it, boom, it comes up. That is non-standard. That's just something I picked up along the way in this environment. Invite me back and we'll have a whole session on all kinds of little goodies like that. But anyway, here's the data maintained outside of the program, outside of a copybook. You now have a data file that you could update with something else. And if I could just make up some other value. Again, it has to be sorted because, well, if you're using a binary search. In this case, we're using a regular search because in this example, the topmost items are the ones that are going to be found the most. These other things aren't as common, especially when you get down here. We haven't seen 3330 devices on an IBM environment in probably years and years. 3330, another device type that's long been retired. So these are the most common ones. So in this example, we would use just a regular search because it would stop searching when it hits one of these more common ones. And we don't need to look through all of these other ones because it will probably find it in the top few. So given that, whoops, over here. That's basically the extent of what I wanted to cover. I have a surprise that we can do whenever, but if there's any questions, I'll take those, or can show you some history and what I started with. This is what existed state of the art, 1982. A 3279 4-color terminal. This is pre-PC. The keyboard that we used, we can see that it's authentic. This is a not symbol. You don't see that anymore. It's still available. If we go back. So this is our, whoops. This is our splash screen, or was until recently at UC Irvine, what we saw when we logged in. This is a close-up of the keyboard of that the terminal that I showed you. There's a command that maybe not all of you have heard of or seen, or a character that can be produced on this keyboard called the field mark. It's basically a separator character that you can stack commands, and it acts as a separator and then issues a return. It's a semicolon with a line over it. It's available in the Tom Brennan emulator. Most emulators, you can use this. If anyone out there knows what the dupe key does, I never figured that one out, but I do use this, and I can show you that at the end of the session. The editor that I was using, the PF keys, just to show you, illustrate, this is the reason why PF 7 and 8 are up and down, because if you see this pattern, and we had 24 PF keys, so if you subtract 12 from this, you get the equivalent now. The lower numbers were up here. This was the primary standard PF keys to move around in the editor, but up and down is was PF 7 and 8, and that's why, I like to know the history of why something happened. That was up, that was down, that was left, and that was right in the day, and that's how they came up with that convention in the editor.
Yeah, and Scott, can you hear me? This is Paul.
Yes. Yes.
So there was a comment, and I was just going to go ahead and read the comment to you. So it goes back a little ways in your talk. It said, next sentence, good way to create bugs in long if statements. Some nested if statements went on for pages. And so it was just a comment that a person made.
Okay. Now you'd probably see continue used. But anyway, yeah. Let's go on. Let's see. Whoops.
Yeah, and Scott, there was another comment that it was in YouTube, and the person was intrigued by you compiling interactively. And the person said, how can I do that in my shop? And I actually mentioned that many times the system programmers or automation team have to do that. And they prefer, in most production shops, they'll prefer for you to put it in the background to manage the resources. But IBM would love it if everything was done interactively. We would just sell a lot of hardware and software, as you know.
Well, actually, what you just saw me do a few minutes ago was not in the foreground. It was the command that I used is actually a C list. And it was this one. And what it ends up doing is a background compile. It actually it submits a job to do it in the background.
So as a system programmer, I would be happy now.
So yes, there is a way to compile things in the foreground, real time, but that's not what this did. It sort of looked like it, but it actually ended up submitting a batch job to do it. And again, that's a whole nother session. Invite me back and we can have lots of fun talking about those kind of things too, setting all that up and so forth. An hour isn't a lot of time though. But I did want to illustrate one more thing if there's time. Whoops, in this JCL. So this is basically standard compiled JCL that was given to you for the class, but it's like, what is that? There's two conventions here: to execute a program or to execute a proc. This is a proc that's actually more JCL somewhere. Again, a non-standard feature that we could talk about in another session, but I set up a macro that if you put your cursor right there and you press enter, boom, you have now pulled up the additional JCL that it's really executing. This is what it's really executing when you say execute proc. It's actually executing this thing and has additional steps in here to go through. That's the compiler, the Cobol compiler. This is where to find it. This is your input program that it's looking for. That's your system output. That's the executable or object that goes on to the next step. And these are just, I guess, work. It needs these to do work stuff that the compiler needs, space to do interim, interim stuff. I don't know. I'm not a systems programmer. This step then starts, that's the linker or binder. I'm not sure what it's called these days. These are some other resources if it needs them. That's where the system output goes. And this is from the prior step. It's looking for that as input from the compiler. And that's where the final executable ends up going to your ID, load, and that's a symbolic for the source that you provided way up here. That's a quick tour of the Cobol compiler proc that it calls. But backing up a step, so you called that proc, you overrode some things. I overrode, that's where the input is coming from. I'm overriding where I want the output to go. And this is a second execution of the compiler proc with, so that was a subroutine that I did. And this is a main program, the main program that calls this subroutine. So two separate steps. That first it's executing or compiling the subroutine, then we're compiling the program that calls that subroutine. And another little trick, this in the JCL says that's the end. Whatever comes later is ignored. Forget it. We don't even need to worry about that, but it's a good place to stash comments. And I got to show you guys one more trick before we end here quickly. Whoops. So I said we would have a little surprise. You have just enough time. We're going to submit this version. Make sure. Clean up by all this other stuff out here. And I think let's take a trip into my computer room. Oh, there's Bob and Nancy, my assistants. And here's my trusty IBM 1403 line printer. Big workhorse back in the day. There's the proof of, yes, there, that's what it is. And if we go over here, where am I? Oops. I don't see my command window. I need that. I'm going to go retrieve my output that I just ran. Using this, just uses FTP as a method to access the mainframe. And I'm going to switch screens. How do I switch to the other one, Sudarshana?
Sudarshana's sound is having a little bit of a problem, so but I'm not sure. And Scott, there is one last question here when you're ready.
Okay, I just lost my screen share.
Okay.
Oh,
well, we're pretty. Okay.
Here we go. How do I screen to, oh, share here, and whoops. And here is my output that I just retrieved from my 1403 printer. And here's the report as it would look back in the day, all printed nice and neat on your infamous green bar paper. Can you all see that?
Yeah, they can see it.
And there it is.
And so the last question here, Scott, the question is there any way to test for debug being enabled? And I'm not sure. I've never thought about that or researched it myself.
Well, I don't know the direct answer to that, but there is an old a ready trace command, which was a way to debug your program that's now ignored. It doesn't fail your program, but it used to, if you had ready trace on, it would show every paragraph that got executed. Nowadays, you can kind of simulate that same technique using special names. There may be a way using special names. There's some reserved words, special variables on the system that you can check. You'd have to look in the manual, but I would start with special names section in your Cobol program. That's the closest I could come without doing the research.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And we're about 2 minutes after the hour, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. I'll wrap up for Sudarshana because apparently she lost her sound. And Sudarshana, she normally says thank you for everybody for attending. We put links to more information in the chat line. And I'm on Slack with her. And Sudarshana, if you want me to mention anything else before we terminate here, please let me know. Oh, she actually mentioned she can't hear either, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
We can see her. So I'll Slack her here.
Whoops.
Okay, so I let Sudarshana know that I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up because she cannot hear or talk.
All right.
So thank you, Scott. This was very good, and we got some good feedback. And some have mentioned it's been fun, and they picked up some tricks, so we appreciate it, and we probably will try to get you back. I'll talk. Sudarshan is always looking for content, so very much appreciated.
I think I have plenty.
Yeah, oh yeah. With that many years of experience, I'm sure you do. So I'll go ahead and let Sudarshana know she can end the session. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Thank you.